There's an extraordinary phenomenon that happens once every year when you reach the end of a cyclical period and the threshold of a new one. There comes a time when the barriers between the visible world and the invisible world, between the ordinary reality that you can see and touch and the spiritual realities that ordinarily remain hidden, become extraordinarily thin. And Rudolf Steiner, that extraordinary investigator of the invisible worlds, had a very deep and very specific understanding of this phenomenon. He called this barrier between the physical world and the spiritual world the threshold. And he taught that there were special periods during the year when this threshold, this separation that ordinarily was very defined, very strong, became much weaker, much more porous, much more susceptible to being penetrated. And he taught that the end of the year was exactly one of those periods. It was a time when the threshold weakened in an extraordinary way. It was a time when spiritual realities were able to come much closer to the physical world. It was a time when you could access spiritual understanding, spiritual wisdom, spiritual knowledge in ways that you ordinarily could not access. According to Steiner, the reason the threshold weakened at the end of the year had to do with fundamental cosmic rhythms. Steiner taught that life was not an infinite straight line, but rather a set of cycles, and these cycles were not merely mathematical or conventional. They were expressions of a profound cosmic intelligence that governed the evolution of consciousness. There were daily rhythms. When you slept and rested, the barrier between the physical world and the spiritual world became thinner. There were weekly rhythms. There were monthly rhythms. And there were annual rhythms. Rhythms that corresponded to the movements of the earth around the sun, to the cycles of the seasons, to the transformations that nature underwent as the months passed. And Steiner taught that the end of the year, that moment when the old year was dying and the new year was being born, was the point when this annual cycle reached its critical point. It was the point when the forces that governed the year were becoming weakened, when the old forces were dissolving, when the new forces had not yet fully manifested themselves. And so it was a period of extraordinary transition, a period when things that were ordinarily separate were able to meet, when realities that were ordinarily distinct were able to interpenetrate. Steiner offered a very specific understanding of the nature of this threshold. According to Steiner, the spiritual world was not something vague or nebulous. It was not something that existed only in the imagination. It was as real as the physical world, perhaps even more real in a profound sense. The physical world was an external expression of spiritual realities. Every physical form had a spiritual origin. Every structure you could see had a spiritual counterpart. And the reason why you ordinarily couldn't perceive the spiritual world was because there was a separation, there was a barrier. There was what Steiner called a threshold. This threshold was not a malevolent thing or something that existed by accident. It was a necessary part of the fabric of reality. Because if there were no separation between the physical world and the spiritual world, if spiritual realities were constantly within reach of your ordinary consciousness, you would be overwhelmed. I would be unable to function in ordinary life. I would be unable to do the practical things, the mundane things that I needed to do. So the threshold existed for a reason. It was a protection. It was a mechanism that allowed you to function fully in the physical world without being constantly distracted or overwhelmed by spiritual realities that ordinarily remained hidden. But Steiner also taught that this threshold was not absolutely impenetrable. It was not a fixed barrier that could never be crossed. At certain moments, in certain states of consciousness, in certain periods of cosmic time, it was possible to weaken it. It was possible to see beyond him. It was possible to access realities that ordinarily remained hidden. And Steiner taught that the end of the year was exactly one of those moments. It was a period when the threshold became extraordinarily weak. And so it was an extraordinary opportunity. It was an opportunity to access wisdom that was ordinarily inaccessible. It was an opportunity to understand realities that ordinarily remained hidden. It was an opportunity to establish a more conscious relationship with spiritual worlds that ordinarily remained beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Steiner also had a very specific understanding of why this happened at the end of the year specifically. According to Steiner, there was a cyclical progression throughout the year. At the beginning of the year, in winter, in the northern hemisphere, in the weeks immediately after the winter solstice, there was a particular quality. The earth had reached its closest point to the sun in its distance from heat and light. And so there was a quality of introspection, of rest, of reflection. The plants slept, the animals hibernated, and even in human beings there was a natural tendency to turn inward, to contemplation. As the year progressed, as it moved toward spring and summer, there was a progression, there was an expansion, there was an awakening. The earth warmed, nature woke up. And there was an increasing tendency to go out, to act, to engage with the outside world. But as the year reached its peak, as it passed through the height of summer, of maximum heat and light, there was a change. The expansion trend began to reverse. As it moved toward fall and then winter, there was a contraction again, a retraction, a movement inwards. And Steiner taught that this rhythm, this pattern of expansion and contraction, was the fundamental rhythm of life. It was the rhythm through which consciousness evolved. And so, when you got to the end of the year, when you were at that point of maximum contraction, when you were at that point of deepest inward movement, a tate was when the threshold got thinner. It was because all this energy was moving inward toward deep reflection, toward the spiritual realm, and therefore it was naturally easier to access spiritual realities. Steiner also taught that there were specific spiritual entities that became more active during this period. He taught that there were beings inhabiting the spiritual worlds, beings of varying degrees of development and intelligence, who were particularly interested in human well-being. Some of these beings were the guardian angels that Steiner had described, beings who were dedicated to the genuine spiritual development of human beings. But there were also other entities, other spiritual forces, that were less benevolent. There were forces that Steiner called ahrimanic forces, forces that were associated with illusion, with deception, with the attempt to keep human beings trapped in materialistic thinking, in ignorance of spiritual realities. And Steiner taught that when the threshold weakened, when the barriers between the physical world and the spiritual world became thin, both types of entities were able to come closer. Both good forces and forces that were not good were able to penetrate the physical world more easily. And therefore, during this special period, during the period when the threshold was weak, there was a genuine struggle going on. There was a genuine cosmic battle between the forces that wanted to help humanity evolve spiritually and the forces that wanted to keep humanity in darkness. And now here's the extraordinary truth that Steiner was revealing. During this period when the threshold was weak, during these closing days of the year and opening nights of the new, you had a genuine opportunity. An opportunity to consciously choose which side you wanted to be on. An opportunity to receive guidance from spiritual beings who desired your genuine good. An opportunity to resist, consciously and deliberately, the attempts of less good forces to keep you in darkness and illusion. And Steiner taught that this had extraordinary implications. Because when you made that choice, when you genuinely opened up to the good forces that were trying to help you, when you genuinely resisted the forces that wanted to keep you trapped, you were actively participating in the cosmic battle. You were contributing to good prevailing, and not just for your own spiritual development, but for the spiritual development of all humanity. Because Steiner believed that humanity's spiritual evolution depended on individuals, on people who made these choices consciously, who refused to remain in illusion, who genuinely opened themselves to genuine spiritual guidance. Steiner also taught that there were specific practices that you could do during this period when the threshold was weak to cooperate with the good forces and to resist the forces that were not good. The first was genuine contemplation, deep reflection on your life, on your development, on your choices. Because when you genuinely reflected, when you really looked honestly at how you had lived during the year that was ending, you were creating space in which good spiritual forces were able to work. You were signaling that you were open to genuine understanding, to genuine truth. Second was genuine prayer. Not prayer with a repetition of empty words, but prayer as genuine communication with higher spiritual realities. When you prayed genuinely, when you spoke from your heart, when you asked for genuine guidance, when you opened your entire being to connection with the divine, you were bridging the gap between the physical world and the spiritual world. And through that bridge, guidance could flow. Third was genuine meditation, the creation of a silent space within yourself where your ordinary consciousness could calm down enough to listen to those subtle voices from the spiritual world. Because when your mind was constantly agitated, when you were constantly distracted, it was almost impossible to access spiritual knowledge. But when you could calm your mind, when you created space for genuine silence, then you could listen. Steiner also offered a very important teaching about the specific role of light during this period. According to Steiner, there was a deep symbolic reason why, especially in the northern hemisphere, the end of the year coincided with the period of lowest light. The winter solstice had just passed a few weeks ago. The days were still very short. The darkness lasted much longer than the light. And Steiner taught that this had a deep spiritual meaning. The darkness of winter represented, on a spiritual level, the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of illusion, the darkness of lack of genuine spiritual knowledge. And so, when you got to the end of the year, when you were at that point of maximum darkness, you were being invited to seek the light. I was being invited to awaken spiritually. I was being invited to receive the light of genuine spiritual understanding. And Steiner taught that when you consciously sought that spiritual light, when you genuinely reached towards spiritual knowledge, towards spiritual understanding, towards spiritual guidance, you were participating in a cosmic struggle. You were helping to bring spiritual light to the world. You were contributing to the victory of the forces of light over the forces of darkness. Steiner also had very specific teachings about malevolent spiritual entities that became particularly active when the threshold weakened. He called these entities demons in a genuine and literal sense, not as creations of superstitious imagination, but as real spiritual beings who had interests that were contrary to the interests of genuine human evolution. And Steiner taught that these entities were not simply malevolent in nature. They had chosen to follow a path that was different from the path of evolution. They wanted to keep human beings trapped in illusion, in ignorance, in pure materialism. They wanted to prevent human beings from evolving spiritually because, in some way that Steiner did not explain in complete detail, humanity's genuine spiritual evolution threatened their interests. And therefore, when the threshold was weak, when they were able to more easily penetrate the physical world, they were particularly active. They were working overtime to try to keep humans in the dark. And Steiner taught that you can perceive this activity, being able to recognize its effects. Because you would often find, during this period at the end of the year, an intensification of certain illusions, certain patterns of deception, certain temptations to abandon the path of genuine spiritual development. And if you recognize these as activities of forces that were not good, if you name them clearly, you would be able to resist them much more effectively. Steiner also taught that protection was available against these malevolent forces. According to Steiner, when you genuinely invoke the protection of your guardian angel, when you genuinely invoke the protection of the forces of light, you are establishing a spiritual defense. His guardian angel and other benevolent beings were fighting alongside him, literally fighting off the attempts of less good forces to turn him away from the path of genuine spiritual development. And therefore, Steiner taught that you are never truly alone in this fight. There were reinforcements available. There was protection available. All you had to do was ask, genuinely and wholeheartedly, for protection, for guidance, for help in resisting illusions and deceptions. Steiner also offers teachings on how to specifically recognize the activity of less good forces during this period. According to Steiner, there were certain symptoms, certain signs that revealed its presence. One of the most common signs was an increase in confusion, a vague feeling of not knowing what was true, of being unable to think clearly, of being surrounded by obscurity, of intellectual. Another sign was an increase in despair, a feeling that nothing mattered, that change was impossible, that good could never truly prevail. Another sign was an increased attraction to illusions, an increased susceptibility to false beliefs, to ideologies that seemed plausible but were fundamentally against truth and genuine human development. And Steiner taught that when you recognize these signs, when you say to yourself, "This is the activity of forces that are not good, this is an attempt to keep me in the dark," you can establish a defense against them, because recognition was the first step in resistance. Once you clearly saw the presence of these forces, once you stopped being deceived by them, you could resist much more effectively. Steiner also taught that there are specific qualities that you can cultivate during this period to protect yourself against these forces and to align with the forces of light. The first was clarity of thought, clarity of intention, clarity about which was actually truth and which was illusion. When you cultivated clarity, when you refused to accept confusion, when you insisted on thinking clearly and honestly about reality, you were arming yourself against the forces of confusion. Second was genuine hope, not the illusion that everything would be easy, but realistic hope based on an understanding that good was truly possible, that light could win, that spiritual development was genuinely possible. When you cultivated genuine hope, when you consciously rejected despair, you were placing yourself on the side of the forces that believed in future good. Third was courage, the courage to stand alone if necessary, the courage to refuse illusions even when they were widely accepted, the courage to seek genuine truth even when it was hard to find. Because the less good forces relied on conformity, on fear, on a willingness to follow the herd. But when you had genuine courage, when you were willing to be alone if necessary, you could resist much more effectively. Steiner also offered a teaching on the relationship between your consciousness and the weakening of the threshold. According to Steiner, it wasn't simply that the threshold weakened impersonally, as if it were a cosmic event that happened independently of you. In a sense, their consciousness, the collective consciousness of humanity, was actively participating in weakening the threshold. As you approached the end of the year, as nature withdrew and life forces contracted, as there was less external distraction, people naturally began to think more, to contemplate more, to turn inward. And this collective turn inward, this turn of human consciousness toward genuine reflection, was weakening the threshold. It was creating the conditions in which the spiritual worlds could come closer. And therefore, in a real sense, you and every human being were participating consciously, or even unconsciously, in weakening the threshold. And therefore, you also had responsibility for how that nerf was used. You had a responsibility to consciously choose which side you wanted to be on, which side of the cosmic battle between light and dark. Steiner also had profound teachings about the role of the will during this period. According to Steiner, people often thought of themselves as being mostly consciousness, mostly thinking. But Steiner taught that there were three aspects of the human being: thinking, feeling, and will. And while during most of the year, the tendency was toward thought, toward analysis, toward intellectual understanding, during this special period when the threshold was weak, there was an opportunity to work with the will in a genuine way. Because when you cultivated genuine will, when you genuinely made decisions and stuck with them, you were aligning yourself with the forces that created form, that brought things from the spiritual world into the physical world. And therefore, during this special period, Steiner recommended that you not just passively contemplate, it recommended that you actively decide, that you set genuine intention about what kind of person you want to be in the new year, what kind of contribution you want to make, how you want to be aligned with the forces of light. Because when you made these decisions genuinely, when you put your will behind them, you were creating realities that managed to manifest in the new year. Steiner also offered a teaching on the special symbol of light that was relevant during this period. In many cultures, especially cultural tours that were still connected to the genuine rhythms of nature, there were special celebrations in the period around the winter solstice. There were candles, bonfires, and other lights lit during the period of maximum darkness. And Steiner taught that this was no coincidence. These celebrations reflected a deep spiritual understanding, an understanding that during the period of maximum darkness, during the period when the threshold was weak, it was especially important to bring in the conscious light. That lighting a candle, simply literally physically lighting a candle, was a genuine spiritual act. It was a conscious participation in the victory of light over darkness. It was an invocation of spiritual light during the period when it was most needed. And therefore, Steiner taught that during this period you should do this, and you should consciously bring light into your life and the world around you, not just as a merely symbolic practice, but as a genuinely spiritual act that had genuine power. And now Steiner offered a particularly important teaching about the profound meaning of the weakening of the threshold. He said that many people saw the spiritual world as something remote, something that had nothing to do with their ordinary lives, something that was only relevant to those who were especially interested in spiritual things. But Steiner taught that this was a fundamental error. The spiritual worlds and the battles that raged within them between the forces of light and the forces of darkness had everything to do with your ordinary life. They had everything to do with what kind of world would exist in the future. They had everything to do with whether humanity would be able to genuinely evolve spiritually, whether it would remain trapped in illusion and ignorance. And therefore, when the threshold weakened, when you had an opportunity to access the spiritual worlds and to participate consciously in spiritual matters, this was not merely academic or theoretical. It had genuine practical implications for his life and the future of humanity. Steiner also had very specific teachings about a practice you can do during this special time. He recommended something he called a life review, a deep contemplation not just of what had happened during the year, but a genuine understanding of the spiritual meaning of what had happened. Because according to Steiner, when you genuinely reviewed your life, when you looked not just at external events, but at what they meant spiritually, how they had transformed you, what you had learned, you were becoming capable of a much deeper understanding. And when you gained this understanding, when you could see the spiritual weave beneath the events of your life, you were able to align much better with your own genuine spiritual development. And furthermore, when you did this, when you genuinely contemplated the spiritual meaning of the events in your life, you were creating a spiritual force field around you. You were signaling to the spiritual beings who wanted to help you, your guardian angel, other entities of light, that you were open, that you desired genuine understanding, that you were receptive to spiritual guidance. Steiner also offered a teaching on how to protect your conscience during this period when the threshold was weak. According to Steiner, there were certain thoughts, certain attitudes, certain practices that managed to leave him vulnerable to the influences of less good forces. One was passivity, a willingness to receive any thought, any idea, any influence without thinking critically, without questioning, without using your own discrimination. When you were passive, when you allowed anything to enter your mind, you were leaving the door open to the forces that wanted to deceive you. Another was pure skepticism, a refusal to believe in anything beyond what you can see and touch, an insistence that only the material world was real. Because while it was important to be critical, it was important to be rational, pure skepticism resulted in a total closure to the spiritual worlds. And therefore, you were becoming inaccessible to the forces of light that wanted to guide you. Steiner taught that it was important to find a middle ground, to be rational and critical, but simultaneously be genuinely open to the spiritual realities that truly existed. Another was fear. When you lived in fear of less good forces, when you were constantly scared, you were creating an opening for those forces. Because fear created a vibration that attracted them. Instead, Steiner taught that you should be vigilant, attentive, but not scared. Should be protected. Aware that he had protection available, but not fearful. Steiner also had teachings on how you can truly help the light win during this critical time. According to Steiner, there was a common misunderstanding that you could only help through external action, by doing things in the physical world. But Steiner taught that there was extraordinary power in interaction, in genuine thought, in genuine feeling, in genuine intention. When you aligned your consciousness with the forces of light, when you genuinely chose understanding over illusion, hope over despair, love over fear, you were creating an effect that rippled throughout the spiritual worlds. You were affecting the cosmic battle. Because the battle between light and dark wasn't just happening outside of you, it was happening inside of you too. Each time you chose light, each time you refused darkness, you were weakening the forces of darkness and strengthening the forces of light. And therefore, the most important thing you could do during this period was to align yourself with the forces of light within yourself. Steiner also taught that there was a specific time during this period when the struggle between light and dark was particularly intense. It was during those hours when the old year was truly dying and the new year was truly dawning, usually around midnight from December 31st to January 1st. And Steiner taught that if you could be conscious during that special moment, if you could be awake and contemplative during that transition, you had an extraordinary opportunity. Because during those hours, the threshold was particularly weak. During those hours, you had an extraordinary ability to affect the cosmic battle. During those hours, his own alignment with the forces of light had an amplified power, and therefore, Steiner recommended that you at least try, that you remain awake during those hours, that you reflect during those hours, that you consciously invoke the victory of the forces of light during those hours. Because what you did during that period had consequences that extended throughout the coming year. Steiner also offered a teaching that was actually very hopeful, a teaching that transformed the understanding of the cosmic battle from something terrible to something truly extraordinary. He said that the fact that the threshold weakened, the fact that the less good forces managed to get closer during this period, was not a defeat. It was actually a reflection that the light was really winning. Because, according to Steiner, as humanity evolved spiritually, as more people awakened to the reality of the spiritual worlds, as more people consciously chose to align themselves with the forces of light, this was interfering with the operations of the less good forces. And therefore, these forces had to become more aggressive. They had to make a greater effort. They had to work harder to keep humans in the dark. And that meant they needed opportunities. They needed moments when the threshold was weak, when they could more easily penetrate the physical world. Therefore, when you saw an intensification of deception, of illusion, of temptation during this period, you should not despair. You should, in a real sense, recognize this as a sign that the light is winning, because the less good forces only work so hard when they feel they are losing. Steiner also taught that there was a particular power in consciously understanding this, because when you understood the truth about what was happening, when you knew there was a genuine cosmic battle going on, when you knew there were forces trying to help you and forces trying to deceive you, your ability to consciously choose increased dramatically. Because you were no longer blind. You were no longer operating under the illusion that the world was merely material and that nothing spiritual mattered. You were awake. And when you were awake, when you saw clearly what was happening, you were able to participate consciously. You could consciously choose which side you wanted to be on. You were able to consciously invoke the protection of the light forces. You were able to consciously refuse the deceptions of less good forces. Steiner also had a teaching on hope particular to this period. He said you shouldn't think of the struggle between light and dark as something that was still uncertain. The result was not in doubt. According to Steiner, the light would win. Finally, inevitably, the light would win. Because light was associated with genuine evolution, with genuine development, with genuine progress. While darkness was associated with stagnation, with regression, with illusion. And therefore, according to the very cosmic rhythms that governed evolution, according to the very nature of reality, light had to win. Not because the forces of light were more powerful militarily. In an immediate sense, at a specific point in time, the forces of darkness were able to win battles. But because the curve of history, the curve of the evolution of human consciousness, was inevitably toward the light. And therefore, Steiner taught that you must have faith. You should trust that the light will win, because everything indicated that it was true. Steiner also offered a teaching on what this meant for you personally. He said the question was not whether the light would win. The question was, whose side did you want to be on when she won? Which side did you want to be on when the new year arrived and the threshold strengthened again? Because during this special time, during this time when the threshold was weak, you had a genuine opportunity to consciously align yourself with the forces of light. He had an opportunity to make choices that would affect not only the rest of the year ahead, but his spiritual developments far into the future. He had an opportunity to consciously participate in the evolution of humanity. I had an opportunity to be, when history was written, on the side of light, Steiner also wanted you to understand that this teaching was not merely theoretical. It had genuine practical implications. Because when you truly believed there was a cosmic battle going on, when you truly understood that there were forces trying to help you and forces trying to deceive you, your life changed. You started to be much more careful about what kind of energy you let into your mind. You started to be much more aware of what kind of thoughts you were cultivating. You began to refuse passivity and begin to take genuine responsibility for your own spiritual evolution. And when you did that, when you actually changed, you would find that it had a ripple effect. It affected his family. It affected his community. It affected the world around him. Because when you align yourself with the forces of light, you become an instrument through which light can work in the world. You become a carrier of consciousness. You become a warrior for genuine good, not in the sense of being in physical conflict, but in the sense of being firmly aligned with all that is true, all that is good, all that is beautiful. And now, as you approach the end of the year, as you stood on that special threshold, Steiner offered a final message that was both a warning and a proclamation of hope. He said you should be aware, you should be vigilant, he should be attentive to the activity of forces that did not wish him well. But you shouldn't be scared. I shouldn't be discouraged. Because, and this was the crucial point, you had genuine power. You had access to help. You had the ability to resist. You had the ability to consciously choose. You had the ability to be on the side of light. And when you made those choices, when you truly aligned yourself with the forces of light, you discovered that it wasn't really a fight between unequals. Because although the forces of darkness had certain powers, the light had something that the forces of darkness could not replicate. It had the power to awaken genuine consciousness, the power to bring genuine understanding, the power to create genuine beauty in the world. And therefore, when you aligned yourself with the light, when you consciously participated in bringing the light into the world, you were aligning yourself with the forces that had the ultimate power to win. Steiner also had a final teaching about how you can live knowing these things. According to Steiner, there were two extremes you should avoid. One extreme was neglect, an attitude that none of this mattered, that you were safe, that you could just live passively without worrying. And this attitude left you vulnerable. It left you at the mercy of less good forces. But the other extreme was obsession, a constant preoccupation with forces less than good, a paranoia about deception, a life lived in fear. This attitude was also not healthy, because Steiner taught that the genuine way was the middle ground, serene vigilance, an attitude of being aware, recognizing that there was a battle going on, recognizing that there were forces trying to deceive you, but at the same time being calm, being confident that I had protection, being sure that the light would win, be committed to aligning with the light, but without living in fear or paranoia. Steiner also taught that there was a transformative effect that you could experience imment when I truly believed in this teaching. Because when you understood that there was a cosmic battle, that it wasn't merely that you were having personal difficulties, but that you were participating in something much larger, something that had cosmic implications. It transformed everything. This transformed their challenges into genuine significance. This transformed their choices into genuine power. This transformed his ordinary life into a genuine spiritual journey. And when you saw your life this way, when you saw every moment as an opportunity to choose light or dark, you no longer lived passively. You lived with genuine purpose. You lived with genuine intention. You lived as someone who was consciously participating in the evolution of humanity. Steiner also had a special teaching for those who felt weak, those who felt they had no genuine power to resist less good forces. Steiner said that no matter how weak you felt, you were never truly weak. Because when you genuinely invoked the protection of your spiritual beings, your guardian angel, the forces of light, you had the full force of the spiritual universe on their side. Because a human being alone could feel weak, but a human being aligned with the forces of light had access to infinite power. Because the forces of light, the forces that desired the genuine good of humanity, these forces were the highest powers that existed. And therefore, when you genuinely aligned yourself with them, when you genuinely invoked their help, you had infinite strength on your side. You were never really weak. You were just temporarily oblivious to your own power. Steiner also offers a final practice that you can do during this special period when the threshold is weak. He recommended that you consciously invoke the victory of light, not in a sense of being aggressive or violent, but in a sense of being absolutely clear about your commitment. That you would say, perhaps at the end of the day, perhaps in genuine prayer, perhaps simply in the silence of your own heart, I choose light, I choose truth, I choose awareness, I choose to align with the forces of light. I choose to resist the deceptions of the forces that wish to keep humanity in darkness. Because when you genuinely did that invocation, when you truly put your will behind it, you were creating a very clear signal. You were telling the spiritual beings who wanted to help you, I am open, I am ready, work with me. And when you did that, when you truly stood on the side of the light, things began to change. His life began to change. His consciousness began to expand, and you began to experience the truth that the light wins. Because that was the ultimate truth that Rudolf Steiner was revealing about the end of the year and the weakening of the threshold. That this was not something you should fear, that this wasn't something that left him passively vulnerable, that it was, instead, an extraordinary opportunity. An opportunity to awaken, an opportunity to access genuine spiritual understanding, an opportunity to consciously participate in the battle between light and dark, an opportunity to align with the highest forces in the universe, an opportunity to discover your own genuine power. And when you understood that, when you really internalized that, you no longer saw the end of the year with nervousness or uncertainty. You saw him with genuine hope, with genuine understanding, with genuine determination to be on the side of light. Steiner also wanted you to understand that this was not just theoretical. It was something you could experience directly. Because during this special time when the threshold was weak, during these last days of the year and first days of the new one, you could really feel the difference. I could feel that something was different. I could feel that spiritual realities were closer than usual. And if you practiced the disciplines that Steiner recommended, genuine contemplation, genuine prayer, genuine meditation, you could access spiritual understanding that was ordinarily inaccessible. You were able to receive guidance that ordinarily was too subtle to notice. You were able to establish alignment with light forces that were ordinarily too weak to affect your life consciously. And so this was not something that you had to just intellectually believe. It was something you could know through genuine experience. Steiner also offered a final message for you to take with you as you enter the new year. He said you should never underestimate the power of your own choice, that you were a co-creator of reality. May your thoughts, your feelings, your intentions, their choices, they all had genuine power. That when you consciously chose which side you wanted to be on, when you genuinely aligned yourself with the forces of light, you had the power to transform your own life and to help transform the world around you. That you were never merely a passive victim of circumstances or unseen forces, that you had genuine power. And what power came from her ability to consciously choose, her ability to awaken, her ability to align herself with genuine truth. Steiner finally offered this image for you to take with you. He asked you to imagine, during these final days of the year when the threshold was weak, that the spiritual worlds were particularly close, that the beings of light, his guardian angel, other entities of light, the cosmic forces that desired the genuine good of humanity, were especially close. They were peering through cracks in the weakened doorway. They were watching. They were waiting. They were ready to help, but only if you actually asked, only if you really chose to, only if you really said yes to the light. And so the question was, what would you do during this special time? Would you remain passive? Or would you truly align with the forces of light? Would you let less good forces operate against you without resistance? Or would you consciously, deliberately, with all your will, choose to be on the side of light? Because the victory of light was not just a distant cosmic possibility, it was something you could actively participate in realizing now, in this special period, when the threshold was weak, and when the light wins. So this was Rudolf Steiner's extraordinary insight into the end of the year and the weakening of the threshold. It was not simply an ordinary transition period. It was a sacred period. It was a period when the spiritual world was able to come closer to the physical world. It was a period when there was a genuine battle going on between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. It was a period when you had extraordinary power to affect the outcome, to consciously choose which side you wanted to be on. And therefore, when you came to this special time of the year, when the threshold weakened, you had to be alert. But he alerts in a calm and confident way, because you knew you had protection, you knew you had help, you knew the light would win, and you had the opportunity to be on the side of victory. Steiner also wanted you to know this, that the simple act of understanding this, of truly believing this, of genuinely deciding to align with the light, this was an act of victory. Because when you understood, when you awakened, you were contributing to the collective awakening of humanity. You were helping to elevate human consciousness. You were actively participating in humanity's genuine evolution toward the light. And therefore, your choices during this special period, your choices to be vigilant, to genuinely contemplate, to invoke the protection of the light, these choices had implications far beyond your own individual life. They had cosmic implications. They had implications for the future of all humanity. And so, as you progressed through this special period, as you approached and then crossed the threshold of the new year, Steiner offered this final message. Allow yourself to be mindful. Allow yourself to be vigilant, but at the same time, allow yourself to trust. Trust that the light wins. Trust that you have protection. Trust that you have genuine power. And when you put your full weight on the side of the light, when you genuinely consciously choose, You discover that you are not alone. Discover that you have extraordinary cosmic allies. Discover that the entire universe is working alongside you. And when you feel it, when you truly understand it, you discover that you are stronger than you ever thought, and that together, you and the forces of light can do anything. They can transform the world. They can create a radically different future. They can bring the genuine victory of the light. Because this is the truth. The threshold weakens at the end of the year. Spiritual realities approach. The battle between light and dark intensifies. But this is not something you should fear. It's something you should embrace. It's an opportunity. It's a wake-up call. It is an invitation to consciously participate in the evolution of human consciousness. And when you respond to that invitation, when you truly choose the light, you discover something extraordinary. Discover that you have power. Discover that you were never alone. Discover that there are extraordinary beings of light by your side. Discover that together, you and the forces of light, you can win. The light wins. Really? Truly. And this is Rudolf Steiner's promise. This is the truth he wanted you to know. At the end of the year, when the threshold weakens, the light does not disappear. The light becomes more intense. It gets closer. It becomes more accessible. And if you genuinely align yourself with the light, if you genuinely consciously choose, you will discover that victory is already yours, that you already won, that the light has already won, because that is the ultimate reality. The light always wins, and when you know this, and when you truly know it, you live differently. You live with genuine hope, with genuine power, with genuine understanding that the future belongs to those who choose the light. So choose, in this special period, when the threshold is weak, choose the light, choose awareness, choose truth. Choose genuine spiritual understanding. And when you make these choices, when you genuinely align yourself with the forces of light, you will find that everything changes. Your life changes, your consciousness changes, and the world around him began to change too. Because when the light wins in you, when you truly blossom spiritually, you become an instrument through which the light can work in the world. And therefore, the light wins. Not just on you, but through you, for the whole world. The light wins now. And this was Rudolf Steiner's final message about the weakening of the threshold at the end of the year. It was not a message of fear. It was a message of power, a message of hope, a message that you had an extraordinary opportunity, a message that you were capable of so much more than you knew, a message that spiritual reality was much more real than you had imagined, a message that there were beings of light constantly working for your good, a message that the battle between light and dark was real, but the light's victory was guaranteed, a message that you were able to actively participate in that victory, now, during this special period, when the threshold was weak, and when you genuinely chose the light. So get up, wake up, recognize what is really happening, and consciously and deliberately choose to be on the side of light. Because when you do it, when you really do it, you discover that you are part of something extraordinary. You are part of a cosmic struggle for the good of humanity. You are a genuine warrior of light, and the victory is yours. The light wins. Now, this is true. The threshold weakens, the battle is real, but you have power, and the light wins. Choose now, choose the light, choose awareness, choose truth, and discover that you are stronger than you ever thought. That you have infinite students, that you are never alone, that victory is already yours. The light wins now.